What if the hand that moves is not owned by a singular claimant, but is itself a site where intention and world meet and conspire? The teaching we hold up, sharp and ancient, asks a strange economy of the heart. Act with full presence, but do not cling to the harvest. It is not an injunction to indifference, nor an excuse for lethargy. It is a reorientation of belonging. The labor remains real, the skill exacting. Only the ownership of outcomes is gently dislodged. When the actor learns to stand in that loosened posture, the very texture of work changes from performance to devotion. Begin by attending to the felt difference between doing for result and doing because the doing itself matters. The former is a tall building propped on tomorrow's returns. The latter is a low cottage built stone by stone. Doing for result makes time a ledger of debts and credits, and every moment becomes a calculation. Doing for the integrity of the action opens time into a field where attention can breathe. The skilled gardener waters the plant because it is her care that the plant requires, not because the gardener will claim the blossom as trophy. In such care there is neither greed nor resignation, only a clarity. What can be tended is tended, what cannot be changed is met. This orientation requires a refined courage. To relinquish the expectation of fruit is to face the rawness of effort without ornamental hope. It asks that we meet failure without the collapse of identity, and meet success without the inflation of self. Both response and non-response are part of a discipline, to act fully and to steward the heart so that it neither clutches at praise nor trembles at loss. The reward of this discipline is not a promised prize, but a steadiness of temperament, a capacity to remain present in conditions that would otherwise scatter attention. There is also an ethical clarity in this teaching. When results cease to be the sole measure of action's worth, actions can be judged on different criteria: fidelity, skill, clarity, and compassion. The actor becomes a craftsman whose standard is the work itself, rather than the applause it might draw. In this frame, consequences are still noticed and responsibly borne, but they do not become the yardstick of personal worth. One learns to distinguish between accountability and attachment, between taking responsibility and making one's peace with what cannot be engineered. Metaphor helps. Imagine a boatman rowing across a fog-drenched river. He cannot command the fog to clear. He can only row with skill, attention, and care. Each stroke is significant, even if the sight of the shore is not guaranteed. The boatman's mind does not become restless imagining shorelines. He trusts his competence and accepts the river's mystery. In time, shore appears, or does not, and the river keeps its own counsel. The peace for the boatman comes not from certainty about arrival, but from a fidelity to the row. There is a subtle psychology at work here. Attachment to outcomes arises when the ego invests future events with the power to complete its sense of self. Release of that attachment is not self-erasure, but a reallocation of trust, from imagined future validations to present integrity. When identity is no longer hostage to applause, action can be undertaken with a kind of lightness that paradoxically deepens engagement. The heart moves as a witness and a worker, neither dissolving into passivity nor hardening into compulsive striving. At the edge of this reflection, a small paradox emerges. To care deeply and not to clutch the result is itself a form of care that yields truer fruit. If the harvest is understood as ripeness of character, patience, steadiness, compassion, then acting without attachment often produces a richer yield than actions driven by anxious expectation. Still, the practice is subtle and demanding. It asks of us daily returns to the present, to the quality of attention we bring to each gesture. As this part closes, imagine the boatman pausing mid-stroke and listening, not to the distant shore, but to the current under his boat, the living movement that both supports and resists. What would you hear if you learned to listen to the current beneath your own actions? The boatman paused mid-stroke and leaned his ear to the movement that carried him. What he heard was not a destination, but a conversation between water and craft, an intelligence in motion that both permitted and repelled his passage. Picking up this image, let the attention slide from the visible arc of effort to the subtle forces that make effort meaningful. Action without attention is like shouting into a canyon. Sound returns, but nothing changes. Action threaded with presence learns the grammar of relationship, how intent meets circumstance, how skill communes with contingency, and how the heart is shaped by the medium through which it acts. Consider the current beneath the oars as an emblem of context, unseen, continuous, and decisive. It is neither friend nor foe in moral terms. It is simply the condition within which all rowing occurs. To act wisely is to cultivate sensitivity to this context, so that each stroke aligns with the directionality of reality, rather than resisting it pointlessly. There is a sanctity to such alignment, for it honors reality's givenness without surrendering agency. The worker who tunes their motion to the current experiences a refinement of energy, fewer wasted gestures, clearer intention, an economy that feels at once practical and sacred. This refinement has consequences for identity. When the self is liberated from the tyranny of result, action becomes a field of practice where competence and character can grow uncoerced. The craftsman who hones a skill for its own sake discovers a depth of satisfaction that applause cannot substitute. The shape of their life begins to resemble a workshop, tools kept in order, tasks performed with care, mistakes examined rather than repudiated. The self ceases to be primarily a claimant of outcomes and becomes an artisan of attention, attentive to the quality of the work performed, to the trace it leaves in the world and in the soul. There is also a moral tenderness embedded in this posture. When actions are untethered from compulsive expectation, they tend to be less coercive toward others. Decisions made from this place are more likely to respect the agency of those involved, to consider effects beyond immediate instrumental aims. This is not a retreat into passivity, but the cultivation of an ethical horizon where consequence is noticed without being allowed to colonize the doer's interior life. Mercy and firmness can coexist because neither is demanded to prove the doer's worth. Psychologically, the practice offers a liberation from a particular kind of anxiety, that a person's value is measured by outcomes they cannot fully control. Detaching from this metric does not mean avoiding responsibility. Rather, it changes the grounds upon which responsibility is born. one answers for what one can shape, one's attention, craft, and choice, while acknowledging that the ultimate results are partly the work of forces beyond the personal plan. This acknowledgement can bring a certain perverse clarity. Energy becomes available for doing rather than for rehearsing scenarios of future judgment. Metaphors help to further refine this understanding. Picture a potter at the wheel. The clay resists, yields, and is partly transformed by forces the potter cannot command. Yet the hand's steadiness, the measured pressure, the timing of a breath, these matter immensely. The potter cannot promise how the kiln will alter the piece, yet the piece's present shaping is the only field of real influence. The dignity lies in attending to the shaping with full presence, not in bargaining with outcomes that belong to the next stage of the process. The current beneath the oars also speaks to timing. Some efforts require acceleration, others demand patient, repetitive tending. The wisdom in action discerns between seasons of intensity and seasons of quiet maintenance. It recognizes when to push and when to hold, not by forecasting guarantees, but by listening to the interplay of necessity and capacity, of external demand and internal resources. Rhythm becomes an ally, steady strokes across long hours, rather than sporadic bursts aimed at spectacle. As this reflection gathers itself into a concluding curve, imagine the boatman once more feeling the current, a subtle incline to the left, a warm eddy that promises nothing and offers direction. What might the life shaped by such listening resemble? What forms of steadiness would take root when action is no longer exercised to claim fruit, but practiced as fidelity to the present medium? The boatman felt the warm eddy and the slight tilt to the left. He adjusted not to seize the shore, but to keep rowing with an honesty that matched the river's temperament. That small motion is where the final teaching waits, not in arriving, but in how the arrival is approached. The current instructs the hand teaches the heart, and in their mutual attendance, a new grammar of life emerges, one that no longer measures worth by trophies gathered on distant banks, but by the care given to each stroke while the work is being done. Consider the last image as a harbor not of endings, but of plausible resolutions. A harbor holds boats without owning them. It offers mooring without claiming the voyages that preceded them. Acting without attachment builds similar harbors within the self, spaces where effort rests from its perpetual accounting, where responsibility is honored without the compulsion to convert every outcome into a verdict on one's being. In such harbors, the practice of action becomes a form of devotion to the immediate, a fidelity to presence that outlasts the ephemeral satisfaction of success and the corrosive sting of failure. There is a kind of quiet heroism in this stance. It is not loud. It is the daily steadfastness of those who show up and care, who carve meaning from necessity by their refusal to equate life's value with visible returns. The craftsman who shapes a piece without demand for applause discovers, often to quiet surprise, that the shaping itself polishes character. The teacher who offers attention without counting affirmation sees students transformed in ways that praise cannot account for. The parent who tends a child without tallying gratitude learns that love's harvest can be slow and subtle, roots deepening in times when the canopy seems invisible. Psychologically, surrender to the labor itself untethers anxiety from outcome. The mind that stops rehearsing future judgments finds its energy available for presence. Freed from the tyranny of anticipated acclaim or blame, one's capacities deepen. Attention becomes more refined, decision-making clearer, endurance steadier. This shift is not a denial of consequence. It is a reallocation of the nervous system from performance to participation. One becomes less of an actor playing for a distant audience and more of a member of a living process, responsible to the moment and to the integrity of one's gesture. Ethically, the liberation from fruit-bound action softens the ways we treat others. When we stop viewing relationships and projects as means to personal validation, we act with less manipulation and more respect. Collaboration becomes possible in a purer form because the need to win is diminished. Dialogue can be pursued for its own enrichment rather than for tactical advantage. The less we depend on external proof of worth, the less we coerce the world into confirming our identity, and the more we allow ourselves to be shaped by the realities we face. Imagine now a simple ceremony. A person washes a single cup with patient hands. The gesture repeats across thousands of households. Invisible in its ubiquity, humble in its intent. Yet in that repeated washing, when done with attentive care, there is a sanctification of the ordinary. That cup may never be spoken of in histories, and no statue will be erected for the act. But the life that carries such rituals is refined in ways that trophies cannot reach. The accumulation of these small attentions creates a character whose worth does not depend on applause, but on the quiet integrity of its daily acts. The paradox tightens into clarity. Letting go of outcomes does not diminish striving, it concentrates it. The energy once wasted on anxious forecasting becomes raw fuel for mastery and kindness. The boatman who rows without clutching the shore rows with more exactness because his concern is the fidelity of his movement, not the certainty of arrival. In this fidelity, paradoxically, intentions ripen into outcomes more often and more sanely than when they are driven by clutching expectation. As this final movement unfolds, picture a morning when the river is glassy and the oars move in a rhythm so effortless that each stroke seems to sing. The boat does not hurry. The sky is patient. The work is being done, and it is its own witness. In that quiet, the inner voice that demanded results grows small and loses its tyrannical tone. Space opens for a different kind of hearing, the testimony of steady, unpossessed labor. This testimony is not noisy. It is a quiet harbor where the soul comes to moor, and in doing so, learns to trust its own simple, unadorned work. Close with a thought that is not a conclusion, but a living instruction. Act fully, attend deeply, and do not chain the heart to outcomes. Let your labor be a practice. Let your practice be your devotion. And let the life that emerges be testimony enough. In the end, the river does not ask whether you won. It only knows how you rode.